I am, in fact, David Orr. I was one of the first artists in residence here and established a residency program, founded the Hansel Gallery, and the Contemporary Arts program here at PRS. And the idea was there was a rich history between Manley Hall and this institution, and artworks, of course. Everywhere you look, you can see a sculpture or a print or a piece of art. And I wanted to extend that to a contemporary world of art. And so I began, we talked about establishing an alternative space, which we did, and we have shown a number of artists here. And Burton Kopelow is a very interesting person to show here because he actually spent a lot of time here. He, when he moved to Los Angeles, he was quite influenced by the cultural scene, and he actually spent a lot of time in the archives here researching, reading, and also corresponded with Manley Hall. But before I go any further, I want to introduce my fellow panelists. First of all, Nancy Blumstein. Nancy is Bert's widow and has created a wonderful book, Paths of Discovery, which is a labor of love. We'll get into that in a little bit. And when I went to her storage space to take a look at some of Bert's work, I saw the two mandalas that we created this installation from, and I was really astonished by them. The first thing I always want to say about that work is that, to me, it feels utterly contemporary. If you saw that in a gallery anywhere in the country or on a wall by a street artist, you would immediately assume that it had been done yesterday. And in fact, the work was done in the 70s, so it's pretty impressive. We're also fortunate enough to have Dr. Sandra del Castillo here.
Thank you, thank you.
She holds a Ph.D. from Pacifica, and she is, well, you tell it because I'll screw it up.
Hi, welcome everybody. I'm happy to see you all. We weren't sure because it's a closing event, so it's nice to see some faces, even though you're all wearing masks. I'm, like David said, I'm well, he didn't say I was a Jungian scholar. I'm a depth psychologist, Jungian scholar, and a ritual artist. And by ritual art, I mean my art is inspired by dreams, mythology, and the seasons of the year, the moon cycles. And it includes storytelling. In the past, it was theater, ritual dance theater. It's sort of evolves depending on what I'm doing at the time. Mostly I've been in a dissertation cave for many years, so now I'm a scholar. And I'm happy to be here. I'm happy to be part of this, looking at Burton Kopelow's amazing work. He was a visionary artist, and he was very influenced by Jung, and as well as alchemy. I think you mentioned that, David, right? And philosophy. So his art embraces all of those things, and we'll be exploring that today. I think you'll enjoy.
And a quick aside, actually, you mentioned Jung, and that we're going to get into a lot of that because it was one of Jung's one of Burton's favorite philosophers. And as you'll see, as Sandra begins to unpack, it has an enormous influence on his work. But interestingly enough, Jung also researched here. He had correspondence with Manley Hall because of PRS's large alchemical collection. So there's a nice synergy there.
Exactly.
I'm going to read off my screen for a moment. I'm going to keep that to a minimum, but I want to make sure I get this language correct, and then we'll get into the presentation. You're going to hear a lot of definitions of squaring the circle, but this is one that takes it from a more mathematical and the original meaning. And squaring the circle is a problem proposed by ancient geometers. It is the challenge of constructing a square with the same area as a given circle by using only a finite number of steps with compass and straight edge. The difficulty of the problem raised the question of whether the specified axioms of Euclidean geometry concerning the existence of lines and circles implied the existence of such a square. It's famously been thought of as a problem that's unsolvable, although we recently saw on the internet that someone thinks they may have solved it, so that's kind of fascinating. Burton Kopelow had worked in several decades, the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s. He was a peripatetic artist. He had lots of different phases and a lot of different interests, and you'll see, I'm going to go through a slideshow to take you through his work. You'll see him returning to ideas and then exploring new, and it's interesting to see the different, the range, I guess is what I'm trying to say, of his work, because no two chunks of work or sections of work were the same, and it's pretty remarkable. He came back from World War II, and like so many people who were disillusioned by a war, like Thomas Merton went off to spirituality, Burton Kopelow decided to study philosophy, and this is Burton in the 50s. He was also spending a lot of time with, artists, not hanging out with artists, but very much aware of what was going on in the art scene, and beginning to pick up a lot of influence from folks like de Kooning and those kinds of folks. Abstract expressionism was having its heyday. This is Bert after he moved to California. And he actually spent a bit of time around the group of artists from the Ferris Gallery, which was a seminal gallery here at a time when contemporary art was outlawed in Los Angeles. These Walter Hopps and Ed Kienholz started a gallery, Ferris, to show contemporary art, which was a pretty radical step for its time, and a dangerous one too. And they went on to launch a number of careers, including that of Andy Warhol, who first showed his Campbell soup paintings, not in New York, but here in LA at Ferris. They were also relentless self-promoters, and I think that may have rubbed Bert the wrong way. I feel like he's the kind of person who's more about the work and less about making noise about it, which may also be one of the reasons he only showed once in his entire career, a solo show in the 2000s.
2014.
2014. See, this is why it's good to have experts with you, so you can ask them the things you fumble over. This is Bert in 1973. This is in San Francisco. Bert in 1988. And we did a presentation with Myth Salon where we were fortunate enough to have Gary Gach with us. Gary was actually ordained by Thich Nhat Hanh, who recently passed. He started the Plum Village Monastery. And Gary is a heavyweight in Buddhist circles. And one of the things that he said was that fellow artists used to call Burton the guardian of the threshold. Again, an artist, someone that everybody who was working on art knew, but perhaps not a household name. So I'm going to get into showing some of Bert's work. Before I jump into that, I'd like to actually toss it over to Nancy and have her talk about the book a little bit, because it's important you guys can get a sense of what that's about.
Because part of what we're doing is not just the lovely gallery presentation and everything, but also it's a book launch. So, so how did I actually come to make this thing? It kind of crept up on me over a period of time. And I'd say it started in the mid-90s when I met and then soon married Burton Kopelow, taking advantage of my background in theater production and design and my 35mm camera. Bert asked me if I would take some snapshots of some of his paintings. And over time, I became his archivist, framer, and printmaker, helping mount his first solo show in 2014, which was when he was 89 years old. A few years later, I was given the opportunity to curate a posthumous retrospective, which I titled Burton Kopelow, Paths of Discovery. And David Orr was able to make it to that show, thankfully. And fell in love with Kopelow's work and asked to include one of his paintings in the Hansel Gallery, the new gallery here, its first group show, which was titled The Unified Field, later that same year. So after these two shows in succession, I kind of just took a deep breath and realized I had all this material. And over the years, I'd built Kopelow's catalog, which contains over 3,000 pieces, plus his sketches and notes. So I decided to write a book. It started with the content from those 3 shows. And I just want to add that there were so many people who helped along the way. Friends, family, colleagues, who were always very free with their time and with their knowledge, and I couldn't have done it without them. And I would especially like to thank Lena Brooks, who was the best editor, proofreader, and cheerleader I could have ever hoped for. And she's here today, so. So in the end, we come up with this, and the obverse. So Burton Kopelow, Paths of Discovery, on sale in the bookstore right now.
And Nancy actually has brought some of Bert's original chops, and we'll chop a book if you are interested in getting one. So another thing that Gary Gach mentioned to us was this quote: "The reason I'm an artist is because of a shade of blue in a certain painting by Titian." I love origin stories of artists and finding out what triggered them to begin to throw their hat in the ring or become interested in art. I think there's a crucial difference between looking at work and then deciding to actually make it yourself. And sometimes it can be as simple as a shade of a color that popped to you one day. I'm going to take you quickly through some of his work. This is from the 1950s, 1965. Whoops, that went a little quick. Let me back up. This is in the gallery. This is a tapestry from the 1960s. And you can see already here, there's also already an enormous range of work and styles and techniques that he's employing. And that was really one of the things that struck me about Burt's work. Angel of Death, 1968. I think the date should not go unremarked there. We're going to get into the kairos and the feeling of the feeling of a time. But obviously 1968 was a year that was quite tumultuous. And this is the other side of the 60s. And you can see him beginning to explore the mandala form here. Mandala, of course, is Sanskrit for circle, and it means to be a portrait of the universe. It has a lot of religious significance, but it also has a lot of primal significance. Jung found examples of the mandala in every culture he studied. Late 60s, 70, self-portrait. And you can see again just the difference between this highly gestural work and then more controlled stuff just a year later. He's really experimenting quite a bit. This is one of the pieces that's in the gallery from 75. And this is the companion from 79. And again, I really do want to emphasize that this, to me, seems utterly contemporary. If you could see it today and feel like it's been painted yesterday. Mandala squared. Now expanding the form a bit. Again, getting more gestural. Working with ceramics. getting into the late 80s, 92, 95. And you can see how he keeps hopping back and forth between these very stylized graphic works and then stuff that's much more gestural or extremely gestural. So I gave you the rather dry mathematical idea of what squaring a circle means. This is what Jung had to say about it. The squaring of the circle is one of the many archetypal motifs which form the basic patterns of our dreams and fantasies. But it's distinguished by the fact that it is one of the most important of them from the functional point of view. Indeed, it could even be called the archetype of wholeness. It's worth bringing up here that when I went to Nancy's Nancy's home and storage space, I got a chance to see Bert's library, and it is mammoth. For starters, this is just one shelf, and there was a copy of everything that Jung wrote, everything. And actually, another story that Gary Gach told us was he would see Bert on the beach in Venice reading a book, and he'd say, "Oh, what are you reading?" And thinking it would be like Jacqueline Suzanne or something like that. And he'd be like, "Oh, I'm reading the archetypes of the collective unconscious." He had a really thick textbook on the beach. So always had a nose in a book, and very interested in the ideas of Jung. In the products of the unconscious, we discover mandala symbols, that is, circular and quaternity figures which express wholeness. And whenever we wish to express wholeness, we employ just such figures. Our friend, the circle. So, the mandala is a circle. I mentioned that it's the Sanskrit word for circle. It's a map of the universe. There's always been an interesting tendency for human beings to want to organize the universe and to apply order to it, or to find order in it. And the interesting question for me is always, are we finding an order that exists, or are we imposing an order over it? And an example of that is that when it was first coined, when Pythagoras first coined the term cosmos to mean the heavens, he was taking the word for order, cosmos. So I'm going to start off with Pythagoras in my mandala-a-thon, where he created the monad, which represents the totality of all being. There's the Ouroboros, the snake eating its own tail, again a circle. The circle appears in the Kabbalah, and it's always a circle with forms radiating out from the center. It could be highly geometric, or it could just be forms that emerge from it, but it's always forms radiating from the center. This is the original yin-yang, symbolizing universal balance. Carl Jung's first mandala, a Mayan calendar stone, Buddhist. This is a tanka, but again, a map of the universe. Navajo, Pueblo, Aztec, Catholic, Islamic. This is what heaven looked like on April 25th, 1354, in case you were wondering. Also in alchemical diagrams. Interestingly enough, Sir Isaac Newton also began to explore alchemy after he had done his foundational work in physics. And it's interesting to me that two of the greater minds and people that had the most cultural influence and rational influence both turned to alchemy in their later years, one being Jung and the other being Sir Isaac Newton. The Enso, you inhale and you exhale. It's the full circle. A circular canon. This is the score for one of those pieces that loops endlessly, and some wit created a circular score, which I love. This is a tone circle, of the circle of fifths that John Coltrane drew for Yusuf Lateef. And in a more contemporary zone, here is a visualization of the long player by Jem Feiner. Jem Feiner was a member of the Pogues, and he worked with the Long Now Foundation to create a piece of music that will play for 1,000 years without repeating itself. It was initiated in 1999, and it will continue until 2999. It's a series of Tibetan singing bowls that are hit in random patterns that will not repeat again for 1,000 years. And this is the interface he chose. If you go to Long Player in your app store, you can download an app and you can hear what it's playing right now. It's a fascinating project, and it's meant to have us really think about what deep time means, since everything is so immediate these days. And it's also an interesting artistic idea just to create something that will not repeat itself for that amount of time. So we love circular forms. We love the fact that information radiates out from the center, and it appears everywhere. And at this point in the presentation, I usually bring up the lowly pie chart, because that's another example of that. And then including more sophisticated infographics. It comes from nature, from all kinds of forms of nature. Here's a probability pattern for hydrogen particles that CERN mapped out. And again, it's a center with information radiating out. These are the actual particle paths when they set it off. And again, you can see it's a center radiating out. There's a physicist who I admire and I'm very curious about. His name is Garrett Lisi. There's a very interesting TED talk that he gives where he says the universe is not three-dimensional, not four-dimensional, but eight-dimensional. And I'm going to show you the slides for this to show you that they mimic a mandala form. You really need to watch the TED talk to have it make a lot of sense. But basically, he's taking points out from a center and then redrawing them in different dimensions to show you that according to his theory, there are 8. And I emphasize theory, but I think it's a fascinating idea, and I would bring up at this point that a lot of people that folks thought were kooks turned out to be right, like the guy who figured out continental drift, or Einstein, or the many worlds theory. A lot of times, the scientific community will initially balk and then realize later that somebody was actually right all along. Then I lead it back to one of Bert's works, which to me has this energy of things spiraling around and radiating energy, points of light, all these different factors that capture my imagination and make me think about the way the world might work and how things still shift around. And I actually wanted to mention here, I work on mandalas myself, and one of the things that I'm fascinated by is symmetry because the more symmetrical a person is physically, the more they're going to earn over a lifetime, the more success they're going to have in choosing a sexual partner, the more they're going to be regarded as trustworthy. We love symmetry, and we gravitate towards it. And so I use a lot of symmetry in my work. Note that Bert does not. Note that he creates a completely balanced form without resorting to symmetry. And again and again and again. This is the piece that we put in the unified field, which was about the crossover between physics and philosophy and ways that artists access that. And this is back to our friend in the Hansel Gallery. And that's the scale, in case you weren't able to see it. As Gary Guy said, size matters, and that's true. In this case, it does. So I've always been interested in why circular forms are so fascinating to us. And when I first started working here during my residency, I would be flipping through alchemical texts, Buddhist texts, Taoism, all sorts of different philosophies and ideas, and there would always be a circle, always. And I gave a talk about it here, in fact, and soon after that, a book came out by Manuel Lima, who's an information theorist, called The Book of Circles, which I highly recommend if you're interested in this. He says, a preference for circular shapes is deeply ingrained in all of us from birth. And I have a personal theory about this, which is that the first thing that a baby focuses on in terms of its vision is its mother's eye. And you can argue that the first tactile thing that a baby will go to is a nipple or a breast, but the eye is the first thing that the infant focuses on. And the distance makes sense. Your first line of focus is about 8 to 12 inches. It would be what you were looking at. It's very interesting. And actually, in a moment of synergy, another artist has some mandalas in the gallery here and titled the show, "The Eye is the First Circle." And I remarked on it to Kelly Carmena, who, whenever you remark about anything to Kelly Carmena, she'll say, "I know what that's from," and run over to a book and show you. And it came from Emerson. And he says, "The eye is the first circle. The horizon which it forms is the second. And throughout nature, this primary figure is repeated without end. It is the highest emblem in the cipher of the world. St. Augustine described the nature of God as a circle whose center was everywhere and its circumference nowhere." Here's a quote from Sandra del Castillo, who we're fortunate enough to have sitting right there. And she wrote something about Bert that Nancy and I loved so much that we immediately put it up on the website, and we just thought it articulated so many great things about him. And we asked her if she would be willing to share that with you here.
Surely. I shortened it a little bit because reading is always a little tricky at these events. So the theme of this retrospective, Squaring the Circle, and this amazing book, so aptly named Passive Discovery, introduces Burton Kopelow's work with mandalas, which to my eyes and senses are vibrant containers of the tension of opposites, and likewise images of wholeness. To quote Jung, "In all chaos, there is a cosmos. In all disorder, a secret order. In all caprice, a fixed law. For everything is grounded on its opposite." Caprice, I feel, is a very good word to describe Kopelow's art. There is a playfulness between chaos and cosmos in his opus, revealing a secret order. As Jung put it, without the experience of opposites, there is no experience of wholeness, and hence no inner approach to the sacred figures. Inspired from his travels and inward seeking, Kopelow's art becomes his approach to the sacred, giving meaningful shape to life. As he shared, "I see myself as a painter of the mind, the open consciousness of mind, as the self crystallizes its awareness of externality and its ultimate internality." Here his contemplation of the relationship of externality with what he calls ultimate internality recalls Jung's assertion that our psyche is set up in accord with the structure of the universe. What happens in the macrocosm likewise happens in the innermost reaches of our psyche or soul. Though this notion is something the ancients held fast, contemporary culture just now begins to grasp this cosmological parallel with the soul realms. It is now being explored in both depth and transpersonal psychology, the new sciences, and archetypal astrology, and we find it here in the world of art. Though we are told that Kopelow usually reserved assigning meaning to his artwork to the individual, he did on one occasion clarify, "The bird or birds in this series of paintings becomes the symbol metaphor of the artist's attempt to attain the higher state of being. The characters, the animals, the harmony of the natural phenomena. The masks act as a transcendent control over the mystical, fantastical, magical, into realistic realms of the artist's vision." I felt this quote revealed a lot about Kopelow in his role as an artist and a seeker. Here, it seems his artistic expression is a form of transcendent control and a means of attaining a more profound state of consciousness. It recalls the role of the shaman who, through ritual, enters the enchanted dimensions of the ensouled world to join spirit, body, and soul to bring about healing, harmony, and wholeness for the individual and/or community. Lofty business.
And I think I should probably point out that lovely quote was taken from notes that I found buried. And if Bert knew that I published it, I don't know that he'd be thrilled, but it's out there now.
Yeah, well done, well done.
Well, and let's talk about that a little bit. So, I mean, obviously, you know, when you hear people like Gary Gach talk about always finding Burton with his nose in a book, and one look at the library you guys have, and you can tell that meant a lot to him. And you told me, you know, he was, whatever it was, he loved to read. But it sounds from my discussions with you that he didn't really want to talk much about the meaning, as Sandra hinted. And
Right. As it said in the book, he wanted people to come to the work and bring themselves to the work and find their own meaning in the work. And when people would come to him and say, wow, what does that mean? He would always turn it back on them and say, what do you think it means? So he wouldn't tell you. And so, you know, that he wrote that down for himself would have been unusual also, because he didn't do a lot of writing. But yeah, he really expected the paintings to speak for themselves and for them to really be their own transformation for the audience. And as you know, those two large paintings are part of a series of 24. And those 24 images, he expected them to be shown together, and that if they could be shown together, and that if someone were able to make that journey through those 24 large canvases, which in themselves move in style and sort of progression in how he's painting and how he's viewing the world and how he wants the audience to view the world, that they would come out of that show transformed. And before you leave today, if you haven't already had a look at the model in the back of the room, there's a model of the scale model of how he would wanted to have the piece shown. And if you purchase the book, there's pictures of his sketches of how he wanted it to be shown, and photographs of the model as well.
so do you think one of the reasons, I mean, obviously he had a very controlled idea of how he wanted the work seen and, you know, thought through. And I just want to interject very quickly
Sure.
that, you know, you have to respect somebody who says, you know, you need to understand it for yourself. One of my favorite filmmakers is David Lynch, and he will not explain his films. And it makes the work so much better because you have to come to it. And it's not, you know, it becomes a more pure experience. We live in a time where everything is supposed to be explained, and I really find it refreshing that he didn't. But the flip side of that is, was it his way or the highway when he would talk with curators or?
I think because it was kind of his way or the highway, he wasn't interested in, that he didn't get to actually meet a lot of curators. And when he did, they knew that, you know, a lot of times he wasn't what they could quote unquote sell. And curators implies museums, which is not to say galleries, which are where a lot of people kind of get their start and that's where the LA art world was happening. So, you know, the fact that he did jump around, that he didn't have soup cans reproductions that they could sell endlessly, that they couldn't say, this is what he does. It was very off-putting and difficult for gallery people, and yeah.
Right. Well, I mean, everybody knows there's a lot of pigeonholing, and people want to be able to put you in a box. And, you know, I mean, another story that Gary told that I really liked was he and Burton went to look at an artist's work, and the guy had a show up, and they thought the show was fine. But they went to his studio, and they were like, oh my God, this work is amazing. Why aren't you showing this? And he's like, oh, the gallery doesn't want it. It's not going to sell. And you can see the schism there between if you're putting a lot of work into thinking about what your work means and what you're trying to express and try to express something visually that can't necessarily be explained through words, and you're going through that whole process, to then have to kind of second guess your work and split it into what can become a commodity and what can't. Some people, I mean, Warhol, he made the commodity the work. I mean, that was his genius, whatever else you think about him. But I can imagine that hearing somebody say that to somebody who clearly was thinking as much as Burt was probably a big turnoff in terms of the art world. I'm going to go back to the formal side of things. One of the things that I also want to point out is that even though these works, are not necessarily symmetrical, you can feel a center to all of them. Obviously here, even in this piece here.
Oh, and with the figurative work, he studied classical painting endlessly, back to the 1400s, 1200s, from the beginning, and really understood composition.
You can tell. And I mean, and it's interesting too, like I'm sure you guys have heard of David Hockney's exploration of using, geometry to figure out where to put, how to arrange paintings, and you can see that there was actually quite a sophisticated approach to that, and decoding that is part of it. But I wanted to take it back to Sandra so we could talk a little bit about the 4 cardinal points, and from that to the center.
Let's do.
So the 4 cardinal points, the quaternity, and Jung.
Jung actually took from alchemy to understand the 4 cardinal points better. He recognized that they weren't just directions, but 4 quadrants of the universe. These quadrants basically came from a center. They derived from the center and they radiated back towards it. I think you have the alchemical vessel up somewhere, no?
I do.
Yeah. These are, all of these, he just showed Jung's, those were Jung's, I'm sorry, I didn't see those. Those were Jung's mandalas, and basically those represent the fourfold basis of wholeness and psychological wholeness. Jung was amazing because he denied he was an artist, which is, if you've seen his Red Book, it's stunning, from the calligraphy to the images. So this is the alchemical vessel. He drew a diagram, and the alchemists, they designed their alchemical vessels to resemble the soul, which they believed was circular. And you'll notice that inner circle is the A. And then we have, he letters these. Okay, that's the center. That's the God image. That's where everything flows from. And all of these other, the ones around it, so you can see one from A to B, C, D, E. The cross doesn't enter that circle, but it revolves around it. Now that's an archetypal image. In other words, we find that in patterns all over, the world and through history. But they all come, each one of those, B, C, D, E, come from the A. And the goal for the alchemists was to return to it. That path back was their rite of passage to wholeness. So the center as the rite of passage, this was something that Mircea Eliade, the Romanian philosopher, recognized, as well as Jung, that everything emerges from the center. As Plotinus saw it, the soul moves in circles around an interior center. And this center is where everything emerges from. The soul emerges from it, and the soul trends back towards it, and it attaches itself to the center. What Plotinus said was that this center is where the divinities circle around, and so that was the secret of divinity, was staying attached to the center. And those that withdrew from that center basically wandered as brutes. But you'll see a rhyming, and that's because it's archetypal in nature, that everything, whether it's the alchemist's alchemical vessel, or whether it's the mandala as a god image, everything emerges from that center and trends back towards it. As a rite of passage, this is just such a lovely, David does an amazing job here. What Eliade said was that it's a perilous rite of passage to the center, right? Whether you're, meditating, or whether you're like on mandalas, or whether you're a hero's journey. The hero's journeys mark that, or whether the labyrinths, the steps of the ziggurats, all of those mirror that rite of passage to the center, and its peril. And yet that movement, Jung found it reflected in, well, like the mandala, he found it reflected in alchemy, is that movement is towards our wholeness, our self-image. And let's say that's a path, like on a spectrum from the ego to the self, not disqualifying the ego because that's who we are, but the path towards that self, that with a capital S, that's our God image. When we hear it in the Bible, we're made in the image of God. That's the path towards the center, the return to our wholeness. We come from that, and our journey is towards that, and it's no small task. In Jungian psychology, it's done with an analyst. I mean, there's many paths, as we see worldwide. This particular journey is a rite of passage, and mirrored the world over and through history.
And it extends to all sorts of metaphors, including the tree of life.
The tree of life, the sacred mountain.
The sacred mountain.
Absolutely.
And of course this guy, which leads us nicely into the creation myth. But again, it's interesting that Leonardo da Vinci is using a circle and a square to outline. I'm going to keep it on Sandra for a bit, although she's probably running a little ragged. But
no, it's good.
There's another work of Burton's that I kind of whipped through in the overview that I really like. It's the creation of the universe. And speaking of fours and centers, it's actually germane. So I'd love for you to talk a little bit about that as well.
Okay, first I want to say a little bit about creation myths in general from, excuse me, from a Jungian perspective. Marie-Louise von Franz, who was a contemporary of Jung's, she recognized that they were distinct from all other mythologies. If mythology in Jungian context is a living blueprint and that guides, that is a fount of vital knowledge, instincts. They're like the collective dream of the world. The creation myths have a specific unfolding. A creation myth, as she points out, doesn't really, well, it does, but it doesn't really mean it in a literal sense so much as our awakening. It's a pre-conscious aspect. When humans confronted with a mystery, what they do is project mythological symbols to explain. And at this point, that's when we come into consciousness and awareness. Oh, well, here, this is life. This is the beginning of life. And the world over, creation myths were ritually repeated and enacted at all crucial new beginnings, whether it was the crowning of a king or the founding of a new town or a new country, or even the laying of the foundation of a house. The creation myths were repeated. when that happened, as Eliade said, is that a center was established, that the crucial center, and it transcended time and space, and yet it contained both. And what happens when that creation myth, because it exists, as a force, when it's repeated, from that center, a new world emerges, or new life emerges. It's reanimating. It's not restoring, but it's recreating a new world. And which is interesting because this idea of reciting the creation myths, let's say the Fijians, they recited creation myths, the medicine men. If there was, when things were difficult, if there was an existential crisis, if the rice crop was failing, the medicine men drew a circle around the rice crop, repeating the creation myth of the rice. And von Franz was saying is that what would happen is as if is a Jungian term, because how else do we talk about these ephemeral soul realms other than saying as if? It's as if the rice hears it and is able to grow again and provide ample food. That's a crucial aspect of the creation myth. When this idea of an artist creating a creation myth, that's where you begin to see Kopelow as channeling the collective, sort of the zeitgeist of the collective. And as he does it, his creation myth, he's using the 4 cardinal points in this creation myth. I don't know if you have those, but so we'll see in the center is water. It's the creation. It's the beginnings. In the east, we see the dragon. He associates this with the east, fire, and red. So they have an element and a color. The turtle is in the south. He relates that with water and green. The tiger is in the west. It's earth, and it's black. And the phoenix is in the north, and is related with air and the color blue. Now, I'm going to break these down, let's say, from a Jungian perspective. We'll think of the term, and I'm sure you've heard the term archetype before, and it has a gazillion meanings, and Jung actually had a lot of different definitions for it, but in essence, an archetype is a universal structuring pattern that lives in the unconscious. It corrects and compensates in a meaningful way what is otherwise one-sided, or basically the one-sidedness of the ego. And it only appears secondarily in images, as in mythological images, images in dreams, or imagination. So each one of these, we'll start with the East, because in ritual, again, when ritual begins, the 4 cardinal points are invoked. And that's what he's doing here. This is what Kopelow's doing. So we'll begin in the East, and that's the dragon. Now, for the alchemists, the dragon was the same as the Ouroboros. And so we'll see this, the Ouroboros is the snake that continuously renews itself. So there's a life-death process. The dragon is both celestial, depending on the tradition, or chthonic, right? So it has a lightness and a darkness. The archetypes are multivalent, which means they appear in multiple ways. So you'll also begin to see a theme of sort of destruction and renewal in these archetypes that he brings. I want to say one more thing about the archetypes. The archetypes run on a spectrum. So if you can imagine, let's say, red to purple. So from the most instinctual realms to the most spiritual and everything in between. So as I go through these, so imagine the different styles and qualities of consciousness that each one of these bring to his creation myth. Okay, so then we're going to go to the south. and that's the turtle. Now the turtle, depending on the tradition, the Asian tradition sees the top part of the turtle as the celestial realms that embrace the earth, which was viewed by many traditions as the middle world, right? Held, and this is the earth and this is the turtle. And for the Greeks, the turtle represented Aphrodite because it was it gave, such a fertile animal. I mean, I think Will Smith does this incredible program, this documentary he's done, but he goes to this island where all of these sharks are around because the turtles, it's a turtle island. They just go there to leave their eggs, and it's just phenomenal. So this is one aspect. He's bringing this life-giving force when he invokes the turtle in the south. And then we'll go to the west, right, which is the place of the setting sun. And he's got the tiger there, and it's the color black. Now the tiger, if we think about the tiger, I mean, the tiger is such a powerful force. It's fierce, right? It's used in structures as the guardian of places. And the tiger is also, it's, you sit on a tiger's skin to meditate, to achieve enlightenment. The tiger was worn by the heroes, the tiger skins, the heroes and the gods and the priests and the priestesses in ceremony. And the tiger is also death, right? That's implicit. So we have a ferocity and we have death. And then we go to the phoenix in the north, and associated with air and the color blue. And we were talking about how he was attracted to the color blue. The philosopher Goethe said that the color blue, it recedes, it draws us after it. So the phoenix in alchemy was equated with the peacock. Now, in the alchemical process, Jung saw in alchemy, he began studying alchemy in his 80s, I think, and he saw the psychological, the individuation process in it. As the alchemists begin this metaphorically, this search for gold, they had a process, of burning, beginning with the blackness and the nigredo stages, and all these different stages of this burning the cauldron and moving upward and into the rubedo, which was the reddening process, and the yellowing and the whitening. The whitening being the last, and at that stage, the peacock appeared. Sometimes it was in full color, and sometimes it was white, or it was the phoenix. It was renewal, right? It was sort of rebirth, a transformative process of rebirth. And so this is yet another image. And now we'll go to the center where they all spring from. And he brought this is water. And water in Jungian psychology is always a symbol of the unconscious, right? And unconscious, the deep unconscious, what we don't know. And in creation mythologies, many begin in water, right? Water is the first creations, the beginnings, and that's what he's offering here. To me, the idea that an artist brings a creation myth, it recalls this notion that Marie-Louise von Franz says, that when there is a leap forward in consciousness, often in preparatory dreams, creation myth motifs begin to appear. And I think as an artist, I think that his timing, he, again, channeling the zeitgeist, as we look around us between climate change and the pandemic and now this war, we can see these motifs. We can see the death of an old world as we know it. And the imagining process of a leap forward, of a new world, of the need for creation myths that have been ritually repeated, throughout our history. David asked earlier, are we imposing an order? Or is there an order? Well, yes. The ancient civilizations didn't, beginning in Mesopotamia in the 4th century, ancient civilizations drew their social and political order from the cosmos. You know, like Jung said, we find the macrocosm in the microcosm. The whole idea of the anima mundi, or the ensouled world, is that's something that is archetypal. It rhymes. It moved from the 4th century Mesopotamia through the centuries to Crete, to Egypt, to China, to India, and by 12th century it appeared in Mesoamerica with the Olmecs, and extended to the Maya, the Aztecs, and the Chavin culture in Peru. That's that order. That's the cosmic order that all of the social and political order was based on. That's an organic, ensouled world. This order that we have, well, see how far that's gotten us.
Well, and to support what you just said, Sandra, I agree with the political point too, but I'm going to go back into mythical. There's a great book called The Human Cosmos, which goes into exactly what Sandra was just talking about, how the order of the heavens became a way of ordering the earth. And obviously I was hinting at that with the Pythagoras, coining the term cosmos to mean the universe. But it really gets into a lot of detail, and it's from culture to culture. And that's another interesting thing, that Jung found the mandala in every culture. He found these myths in every culture, and obviously Joseph Campbell latched onto that. There's also, that era called the Axial Age, where many of the world's great religions emerged seemingly spontaneously in different parts of the world that could not have been in contact. And it's almost as if it was a step in our evolution that we needed to believe in something greater than ourselves. Speaking of, the collective unconscious, one of the things that I think about is the idea that Jung, a lot of his ideas came from the feeling that he got in the air, the vibration he was picking up just prior to World War I. And when that war broke out, he felt, I felt this. I saw this coming, or I felt this coming.
He dreamt it.
He dreamt it. And that's what the Red Book is about. And that's where a very powerful aspect of the collective unconscious emerged. And it empowered a lot of his work. I'm going to jump right to the Kairos.
Actually, can I just point out something about the creation myth?
Yes.
Your talk had kind of reminded me, when I was putting that part of the book together, I thought I did some research to try and find out where is he copying these from, right? Are these arrangements of things which are typically arranged in a lot of creation myths, the animals, the colors, the directions, are they from any particular or group of particular beliefs or something? But he took those images and those points, and he made his own arrangement. So they, from what I could tell you, I don't know if you saw any pattern, but I didn't see them sort of correlating to any group of, even
Right.
separately.
Yeah,
correlating to any.
I didn't either. David, would you pull up that picture of the Mayan creation?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
1 second.
That would be great. I didn't either, because I looked for it in the corresponding colors and the directions and stuff,
So it
and I
wasn't
didn't
just
find
me,
it.
right.
No, I didn't find them. I thought, that's him. That's his, yeah.
He was thinking about stuff.
Yeah, well, yeah. I think that it was moving through him, So this is from the Maya creation myth, and I absolutely love these images. These were carved on bone. It's amazing, this kind of detail. So in the top image, these are the paddler gods and the cosmic canoe. And you can see in the center is the maize god, right? And then we have an iguana and a monkey and a parrot and what's the last one? It'll come to me. In any case, this story, they say that the paddler gods are rowing. They're on their mission to find the center of the universe, and it's the creation myth, yes? and they're supposed to be rowing through the waters of the underworld. But it's also, that canoe is also supposed to be the Milky Way. So you can see that association between the underworld, water, as well as the cosmos. It's all sort of the unconscious. It's the blackened sky that they're rowing through. And again, all of these represent psychological, but I mean, when I say psychological, I'm not talking about something that just exists within, but within the entire ensouled world, the anima mundi, the unconscious, and they come forth in images. Now, the cosmos, the social and political order came from the astronomer priests, dating back from Mesopotamia, but Egypt, Crete, Mesoamerica, they all had these priests that was a careful observation of the cosmos, of the, basically, the repeating patterns that they were able to calculate, of their disappearances and returns, of the particular forces, what was happening at the time. Everything sprung from that. The position of their city-states, of their temples, even the homes were dependent on how the cosmos, played out. So many of them matched what was considered the cosmic hearth and the birthplace of creation. Those were the three stars of Orion's belt. And what we know today, this is in Mesoamerica, right? What we know today is that's the Orion Nebula just behind those three stars. That is a stellar nursery. Planets and stars are born there. I mean, look that up on NASA. It's wonderful, because when we say that, that we project, or von Franz says we project mythological images and symbols, yes, but we also receive them. There's that, right? It's something that comes through, let's say, the imaginal planes, as the French philosopher, French philosopher Henri Corbin would call it, those realms that sort of exist between mind and world, or heart and world, because the heart was considered the seat of the imagination. Anyway, I'm going.
No, but I mean, and it's worth actually mentioning that there's a lot of instances where that gets backed up. One of my favorite interviews was with Lisa Robinson, who was a rock journalist, and she said every songwriter she spoke to said, "I didn't write the song, I waited for it to arrive."
That's it.
Everyone. And
those are the imaginal realms.
there it is.
There it is.
Right.
Absolutely. We don't make up dreams. We can't choreograph our dreams. Those images are the images of the soul. That's the language of the soul. Like mythology is the language of the soul. This myth, this creation myth, these images, the mandalas, those, I'm going to venture to say they moved through him. If he was the artist, the guardian of the threshold, I'm going to say, yeah, he was channeling that. That's when Gary called him an iconoclast. He wasn't selling Campbell soup, images. He was channeling. He was waiting for those images to move through him, and that's gold.
Yeah. So, and it wasn't all put highfalutin like, Brian Johnson from AC/DC was more like, it just fucking came to me, I don't know. But it is all the same.
Exactly.
It is very much the same thing. I actually, I want to jump to the Kairos quickly.
Okay.
Because it's something that I think is really interesting. So when I started the presentation, I talked about Burton coming to NYU and getting a philosophy degree after World War II. And then you think about his experience living in the States during Vietnam, and you saw that painting, The Angel of Death from 1968. He was definitely tapping into the feeling of the time. And I wanted to explore a little bit of that from a Jungian perspective, and then get into some of Burt's specific reactions to it. So there's two types of time, according to the Greeks. There's kairos and chronos. Chronos is the chronological, and kairos is the feeling, for lack of a better term. And the kairos
is a Greek word
Yeah.
for the opportune moment.
right.
Yeah, Jung saw it as the opportune moment for the changing of the gods.
So a mood of universal destruction and renewal has set its mark on our age. This mood makes itself felt everywhere, politically, socially, and philosophically. We are living in what the Greeks called the kairos, the right moment for a metamorphosis of the gods, of the fundamental principles and symbols. This peculiarity of our time, which is certainly not of our conscious choosing, is the expression of the unconscious human within us who is changing. Coming generations will have to take account of this momentous transformation if humanity is not to destroy itself through the might of its own technology and science. So much is at stake, and so much depends on the psychological constitution of the modern human. This was written in 1959 in the middle of the Cold War. I think it applies today, which makes this work feel, extra relevant. But I also think that it's something that is imbued in Burton's work, and I'm sure he didn't talk about this. But I feel like I can see it there.
But there again, there it is. Even in the creation myth, there you see it. That leap forward in consciousness. If we are, coming generations, he says, we'll have to take into account this momentous transformation. So that leap forward, to me, that's where you feel that archetypal moving through him, to invoke a creation myth at this point, where life is sort of hanging in the balance. And one of the things that I wanted to say too is that, from a Jungian perspective, archetypal astrology recognizes these times, whether it was 1968 and the Angel of Death, or whether it was the 2007 to 2020, and now the Black Lives Matter, the climate change movement, and as well as the alt-right, mobilizing. The work of cultural historian Richard Tarnas, who is an archetypal astrologer, a philosopher, and a depth psychologist, he traced through history Uranus and Pluto. Here we see the cosmic order, and these kind of disturbances coming in the 60s, coming in the 2000s. But he traces them back because he is a cultural historian through France, the French Revolution, all the way back. He keeps going back as and there's actually a great Changing of the Gods is what it's called, a documentary that you can watch online. But these things, this is what you can see it in the Angel of Death. What's being channeled, to me, in my opinion, is what Burton was picking up on, right? He was just, in his studio, just doing it, and the mandalas, and just that vibrant life, and just moving through it, and looking for that center, the cosmos and the chaos.
So I would love to actually let you guys ask some questions, if you have any.
Please do.
Dun, dun, dun. Sir.
I'm not too familiar with Burton's work, but did Burton have any belief in a spirit guide or any kind of archetype that he felt he was responding to for most of his life?
The question is, did Burton respond to spirit guides? I'm saying for the audio.
Yes, please do.
I realize that you understand the English language.
Yes. So Burton, I don't believe he did have sort of a spirit guide, per se. I know he believed that when your life was over, it was over. and that was it. But he obviously believed that the work that he did was important because of its continuity into the next generation, right? He very much believed that his life continued through his children, and through the work that he did, the way that he interacted with people, the way that we interact with each other. When I knew him, because I didn't meet him until he was 70 or so, at that point in his life, I think he was pretty well knew he might not ever really become famous or known or any of those things, but he kept working because he knew, he felt that the work would somehow find its way. And that, so if I were to say he had a spirit guide, it would have been his painting.
Lovely, absolutely.
And thanks for that question.
Yeah, that's a great question. And there's a corollary to the musician thing that I mentioned about, writing songs and feeling like you're retrieving them. I think everybody here has had a moment where you might be cooking, you might be sitting watching a murmuration of starlings, you might just be zoned out in traffic, where you just go somewhere else. And when you come back, you don't know where you were. And I feel like that's brushing into something larger than yourself as well. We wouldn't necessarily articulate it that way when the person behind us honks and we have to, get back into the swing of things. But we've all had those moments where we get lost in an activity or a moment and actually do go somewhere else. And I think that a lot of artists will tell you that when they're really working, and absorbed in it, that's part of the juice, that you feel that you've lost time, as it were. Any other questions? Yes.
Yes, I have so many thoughts. Thank you guys so much. It's fascinating what you're showing. His work's incredible. I'm sure we're all dismayed that in his lifetime this wasn't celebrated and recognized widely internationally. But you mentioned the Ferris Gallery at that time, and I'm just wondering, he was in LA for a very long time, so he knew all those guys in the space and light era, and what other artists in LA did he hang with? Was he influenced by? So that's one part of the question. And then the other part is, what other artists of the 20th century would you say he referenced? I see a lot of Leger in his work, both the representational, figurative stuff and the geometric constructs that he's painting. So just the influences of other artists, both living in LA and historically in the 20th century.
Well, I'll start with LA since I have a little.
Please go ahead. No, please.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Okay. Just because I had a little section based on that, and since I riffed on it earlier, I didn't. But he talked about getting together, with some of the Ferris folks, saying, there was a fairly active art scene. A group of artists used to frequent Barney's Beanery, and he met Al Toon, Larry Bell, George Herms, Wally Berman, John Chamberlain, and Irving Blum, who he calls an artist here, but who was actually a curator. And so the impression that I get from having read interviews that Nancy has supplied and from having spoken with friends of his, usually in panel format, so they haven't been in-depth conversations, is that he actually did end up gravitating towards artist scenes, but didn't really engage. Would you say that's correct?
Yeah, he kind of hung out, but also hung back.
Yeah, and he would, hang out with artists that were artists themselves, and like the guy, I think he was really dismayed with that story that I told you earlier about, why aren't you showing this work? He's like, oh, because it would never play. I think he was sort of appalled by that. And I think maybe, and I'm maybe projecting, maybe not, you can correct me, I think he thought there was something a little bit unattractive about the way that Ferris was so relentlessly self-promoting. And they were also, but for good reason. Los Angeles was considered a cultural backwater, and Ferris was the only game in town. And the only reason we hear of any of these artists is because there was such a push. And some of them were able to, leapfrog past the gallery scene into a larger context. I'm thinking particularly of Robert Irwin and James Turrell, Ed Ruscha, those kinds of folks. And when you read the history of Los Angeles, it's always a history of boosterism. And I think that, therein lies the rub for somebody like Burton Kopelow, that I think he found it unattractive. And I mean, would you?
Well, I know that, he used to hang out at Barney's Beanery and Cantor's, and knew the Ferris people, and in New York, he was in New York at the time when things were happening in the 40s and the early 50s, but he was studying philosophy then. He wasn't yet painting. But when he was painting in Los Angeles, he did know those people, he did hang out with them a little bit, he did, etc. But one friend of his commented, you didn't see him there that often, he was in the studio. So he would rather be painting. It's nice to get out and see people and stuff, but painting was more important. To answer your other question about influences, he loved Leger, but he also liked to say that it's my work. My influences are me, but his influences were also everybody. He, like I said, loved the pre-Renaissance and the pre-Raphaelites and the just classical paintings from the ground up. He looked at everything. He just loved to see stuff. We went to the aquarium with his granddaughter, and the two of them were staring at the fishes with exactly the same look on their face. And she was, 3 or something, and he was 85, and they both were just the colors and the shapes, and he's always just been delighted by everything visual and loved to study it too. The bookcase that David showed you, about half of those books were art books and monographs, and there's at least another bookshelf like that full of philosophy and painting and fiction and things like that. And he brought out those art books and he looked at them every day. And I think he just loved to look at stuff, and he loved to study it and consider it and look at how somebody else's use of color and shape, and again, the focus of the painting. Is it a triangle? Is it a square? How are those things coming? What is the focus over here, and how does that happen? Does that answer your question?
All of that, thank you.
Great.
I mean, it's a huge discussion. Fascinating.
We could almost look at the paintings one by one.
I think you had a question? Yes, you.
Yeah, I was just, in connection with the earlier question, I was curious about, with his process to connect with the kairos, the spirit of the time. And David, you had mentioned that process or the experience of having a song or a piece of art pouring through or coming through or channeling through. But I was just wondering if he had like a process by which he was able to avail himself of those energies, archetypes coming through. Was there any sort of
Yeah. He's asking, was there a process by which he made himself available to receive
From the kairos.
from the
From the archetype.
or
From
from
the
the,
archetype.
from
Let's
the
say.
collective
The
conscious?
collective
The
unconscious.
collective unconscious,
Um,
good, yeah.
I think more than anything, it was just that he had an absolutely daily painting process that he worked every day. So I know there are people who have like a daily meditation process or daily working out process, or writers who write every day. And part of that is just always being available, right? And I don't know that he did know Jung very, very well and very impressed by him. So I don't really know how much he felt that that was happening, but I do know that he put the work in. And I can't imagine that if you're not concentrating on that every day and studying it every day. So when he wasn't painting, he was reading or studying paintings or golfing.
You know what I want to say to that too is that the fact that he was reading, I mean, not just Jung, but so much philosophy. There's a that's psychodynamic. The reading, it does its, you're reading it, you're working it, but it's also working you. So there's a process that's going on there. And I'm going to say, judging by that library and the fact that Gary said that he was reading the archetypes of the collective unconscious on the beach, that stuff was working him too. I'm going to say that it was just innate.
He read a lot of sci-fi and fantasy
Which
too.
is lovely.
So,
yeah, absolutely. So those are the
but
imaginal realms.
Yeah, one friend said he was Catholic in his tastes and that he just, everything, absolutely everything, whatever, he just wanted to know more about all of it.
I mean, in Catholic, the root word means universal, so there it is, yeah.
I had to look it up. I'm like, Catholic?
yeah, that's it. You look up in the etymological dictionary. Yeah, awesome.
I think there was a question. Oh, I'm going to ask this person and then you. Oh, yeah.
Just a comment. I remember the first time that we were here, like at the opening.
Oh.
You mentioned that he traveled to wherever he wanted to go and stay there and experience that. He went to Mexico, Oaxaca, down there. And he was there for years. It's not just like, just going in for a weekend or vacation. So I think that says a lot about him, that he's able to immerse into whatever he was interested, and then he gathered all of that and presented it to us. One question that I have, how long did it take him to complete that piece of art? The paintings that we have. Was he working on one by himself, or he was having like 3 or 4 and then?
Bless you.
Gesundheit. Let me repeat what you've already said, that the fact that he did not tend to vacation in locations. He tended to be places for long periods of time. Mexico, Oaxaca, New York, San Francisco, Sacramento, Los Angeles. Yeah, he lived places. He didn't visit places. And your question about how long it took him to paint those pieces and how many, he often, always had more than one piece up at a time, as long as I knew him. And I understand that it was also true of those pieces. The earlier pieces took longer than the later ones. There was, I went back and took a look at this not very long ago, and he was sort of producing one of those large pieces every year or two or a couple of years, that kind of thing. But when it came to the final pieces, there became an escalation. And I think partly it's the energy in those final pieces is different. And it's not this whole thing. It becomes an expression as opposed to a calculated sort of Pythagorean piece. And also it may have had something to do with the fact that he'd lost the lease on the 4,000 square foot studio he had, this huge space, so he wasn't going to be able to continue to paint those large pieces, probably. So those last 4 pieces were completed within a year or two, whereas the other ones did take more time. And it may have also been because, he was busy raising his daughter and had a lot more of those responsibilities during that early period. And then, she got up to high school and things like that. So, but I couldn't tell you exactly, but I'm making it up. Right, and not only being experienced with the paintings and the scale and all of that kind of thing, but again, if you go and take a look at the model again, you'll see, and in the book they're in sort of painted order, just about painted order, you'll see that those last pieces are just more energy than, so they may have come out a little bit more that way.
I promised you.
So back to the Ferris Gallery, you mentioned that at the time, contemporary art had been banned. Can you talk a little bit more about that and how that began and ended, that period?
Sure. So this was in 1951 that this was it was banned. Actually, I think I made a note.
And what was the definition of contemporary art at the time, too?
I'm sorry?
What was considered contemporary art at that time?
Okay. So she's asking what was considered contemporary art and what exactly happened. So the quote is from Ferris, A Place to Begin by Kristen McKenna. And she says, in 1951, the Los Angeles County Board of Supervisors made it illegal to exhibit modern art in the city of LA on the grounds that modernism was a front for communist infiltration. This gives you some idea of what Ed Kienholz and Walter Hopps were up against when they opened Ferris Gallery in 1957. There was a famous case where an artist was accused of having painted something pornographic, and the cops were brought in. There was a series of abstract canvases, and they asked the woman, which one was it? And she's like, I don't know. I think it was that one. It was that vague. It shows you what I said, LA bristled at the idea that it was a cultural backwater, but you get a good sense of the provincial mindset. This wasn't just happening here, though. People felt that realism was the right way of painting, and that by getting into abstract expressionism, that you were getting literally outside the bounds of law, and people were very concerned about that.
In Prague, the artists, basically would paint realism with a crack through it. They paint in that crack basically that was their only form of rebelling against that. That's what that to me is, I thought that was just a stunning, piece. But that was in Prague in the 60s.
Yeah, and there was a big link between people worrying about. The best way I can put it is that there would be some sort of ideological corruption that would come from it. And I mean, within art, obviously, there's a lot. It's rife with histories of movements that the previous generation found offensive. If you think about Impressionists not being able to be shown at the salons in Paris, and so on. But in the United States, it was really the communist hysteria really went bonkers. And I think that some of the earlier painters that were doing abstraction were from countries where communism was popular. So Milevich is a great example, or Milovich, sorry, and who was influenced by Theosophy, but
and they left those places.
And they left those places, right?
Came to New York.
Yeah, and came to New York. So that's the kind of thing that was going on, and. Also, honestly, I think when people first saw some really abstract canvases, it just freaked them out. I mean, we're so used to it now. We are so visually literate. We've seen so many images over our time. By the time you're 5, I forget what the number is, but you've seen like 8 million images or something. I mean, and it just goes on. And we have access to it now even more so than we used to. But at a time when you didn't see things all the time, an image had a lot more power. And it's hard, it's a little hard to know. It's sort of like you can't imagine what the real cultural ramifications were of the Rite of Spring because you weren't there. It doesn't sound that transgressive, and yet it caused a riot. I hope I articulated that reasonably well. I think you had a question?
Oh, I was just gonna make a comment to the people who are looking for like a window into the, you know, what made Bert tick, or like, where did his inspiration come from, or whatever. I remember talking to him pretty late in his life when he was, you know, using a wheelchair, one hand, and was still painting every day. And I was like, well, so is it different for you now? Like, what's the, and he's like, nope, I'm here to paint. That's what I'm here to do. I do it every day. I can't not do it. And I think so many artists that I know find reasons not to do the thing they say they want to do. You know, they want to be writers, or they want to be painters or creators of some sort, and there's always like something that's getting in their way, whether it's just earning their daily bread or whatever, but there's always a reason not to do it. And he was one of those people who couldn't not do it. So I think that's, for me, that's sort of the key, is like, he just had to do it. It wasn't a choice.
That's so very true. He could not stop painting. And very close to the end of his life, he did say, I want to stop painting. I have to stop painting. And I said to him, Bert, we went to the art store and spent $100 on paint yesterday. And he said, well, okay. And he'd done this because I just ordered a bunch of paper, and the paper had arrived. He's like, what is all this paper doing here? Because his left hand wasn't working as well as it could, I was taping paper onto big stiff boards that he would then put in front and then paint on. And he said, well, then you have to stop giving me paper. And I said, a little later, at another point, he said, you have to stop giving me paper. I said, you know what? I'm not going to stop giving you paper. I'm just going to put it there. You don't have to use it, but I'll put it there. If you use it, fine. If you don't, don't. He never stopped. He never stopped. I mean, on his deathbed, he was telling us to draw things for him. So every day and every day.
Nancy, you had a remark that someone had asked in an earlier presentation that you particularly liked. Do you want to?
Yeah, I had another acquaintance, Bert, a mutual friend, who said that she'd gone to him also and said, you know, what influences the colors in your painting? Where are these coming from? And he had answered, I use whatever paints people give me, or whatever I have on hand. And she said, but it seems like these color choices are really deliberate. And she said that he insinuated, I didn't have money to buy paint, so I didn't really have those kind of choices. And that he said that there was no real plan or influence when it came to the colors he used. And she asked me, is that really true? And I said, you know, I think that there were probably times when money was tight, and he had to use whatever was at hand. And those of us who've ever worked in design know that sometimes having limited choices can make things very creative. You know, you can only use blue and green on this, so that gives you a real direction. But I think there were also times that and when I looked back through all of his notes and sketches and things, I did see that there were certain pieces that he did plan out very carefully, but I also believe that there were other pieces that he did in the moment on the canvas as he was putting them together. And that's not just the hard, the squishy stuff, it's the hard edge stuff too. Also, he was very careful about how he used paint because paint is expensive. So he would tend to, if he put it onto if he squeezed it out of the tube, he found a way to use it because he didn't want to waste it. Even if it meant that the next piece that he put up, he would do something he liked to call killing the white. So if there was paint left on the palette, he would just take it and loosely put it on the canvas to give a background that wasn't a white canvas. So I think that it was true and that it wasn't true. But and I think he also kind of liked leaving the mystery out there for people to have to think about. And so I'd asked this friend to send me the question because I didn't want to misquote her. And she also gave kind of a comment that she said, after having heard the answer, on a metaphysical level, it could be argued that he didn't have any influences, and that he was tapping into a greater collective conscious, which is what we've been talking about today. And in that case, we should all be so lucky because he created art that feels both original and familiar. So.
There you have it. Lovely.
Well, I think that's a great place to stop. Thank you very much for coming, and thank you, Sandra del Castillo.
Yeah, thank you.
Nancy
Thank you,
Blumstein.
David. Thank you, Nancy.
You're very welcome.
I'd like to also thank Kelly Carmena, the Vice President of the Philosophical Research Society, who
Is she out there?
produced this whole thing, put us all together. And you want to make sure you step out and look in the display cases. She took those pictures of Bert's books and went through and found what correlated within the PRS library, and there's a display of books there and of the book that I wrote. And I think that the presentation demonstrates the depth and breadth of Kopelow's philosophical background. That was what she was trying to help put together. And of course, she brought Sandra to us. Thank you, Sandra. She brought David and I together. Thank you, David. And I'd like to thank David, whose intense and almost fierce support of Kopelow's work gives me absolute faith that this whole experience will continue. And of course, we all want to thank you all for being here today, and those who will eventually join us remotely. What a wonderful way to express your interest in Kopelow's work. So.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks to the Philosophical Research Society for having
Yes,
us.
thank you, PRS.
And I'll be signing books in the lobby, so if
With
anybody
Bert's
has
chop.
smile.